Hola, mi gente, and welcome back to another episode of Entertainx, where we highlight the work and achievements of various Latinx individuals across the entertainment industry. I am your host, Ingrid Nin, and on today's episode, I will be talking with the talented, the spectacular Juan Luis Bravo. Juan Luis is a story artist and filmmaker with a passion for stories about love, friendship, and everyday beauty. He was trained in live-action filmmaking at the University of Southern California, has worked as a director and editor, and is currently a storyboard revisionist at Wild Canary Animation. His career aims to tell stories in live-action and animation that amplify marginalized narratives while speaking to the strength of kindness. Hey Juan Luis, how are you doing today?
I am doing amazing, Ingrid. That was a very generous introduction.
Well, I want to, make sure that our listeners can get the whole scope of who you are and what you're doing. So, thank you for coming on today to speak.
Thank you for having me and for hosting a podcast like this. Again, I hope this would be really beneficial for people to hear from other Latinx kids who are working in this crazy industry.
Aw, thank you. Yeah, that's my goal with this, to show that, no matter where you come from, us as Latinx individuals have this community and are here within the entertainment industry, including you. So, to get things rolling, how did you get into filmmaking and animation in the first place? What inspired you to decide to go into this field?
My family has always been really into storytelling. I mean, we're Mexican American immigrants, and I feel like it's just a kind of family tradition, like to just share stories all the time. Like my parents sharing stories of their own childhood. My parents were always great about. I didn't realize this until looking back in retrospect, but they always asked about our day at school and what we learned. And I guess it just built up this tradition and culture of like storytelling every single day that actually had like really practical purpose. I'm one of four siblings, and so we're all staggered like a couple years apart. And I think for all of us, we all benefited from hearing what the other ones were going through at school and always learning from that and building on that to the point where like my oldest sister was very much the trailblazer, figuring things out for the first time and then reporting back. And so everything was just a little bit easier for every sibling that followed after that. And so to that note, when it comes to animation and storytelling, we were all really into like the Disney animated canon of the 90s. Which was like new at that time. In retrospect, again, I think that my parents were really into it because, they themselves were immigrants. And so the stories are just a little easier to follow. It's not like an Aaron Sorkin drama that's super verbal. The storytelling is largely visual. And at the same time, like little kids just are super enamored with Disney animation, the music, the storytelling, the characters. The beauty of that time, I think, and this is what I remember, but I remember to convince people to buy those VHS cassettes, they would bundle it with like little mini featurettes about the making of the animation. Like you'd see interviews with animators flipping drawings. And so like the process was presented to you at the same time you got to experience the finished thing. So I just immediately got into drawing my own stories. I was not brave enough to be that because I feel like it's a pretty typical filmmaker thing to talk about recruiting the neighborhood kids to make a movie with you. That was not me. I was way too shy for that. But I did learn that with enough patience, you can animate something by yourself, whether that's in drawing or stop motion. Because around that time, I think was also when like personal computing was a thing. It was becoming a thing, which is kind of crazy to think that that was happening as I was growing up. But suddenly, my dad bought a computer for work, and when he wasn't using it, I could use like Lego Movie Studios. I'm trying to remember what it was called, but it was like this little software that let you use Lego figures to create stop motion, and all it was a webcam, but it was branded with Lego.
Oh, that's so cool. So you were like at the very forefront of like, oh, let me just record this with my camera and see where it goes, even if you're doing it by yourself.
Yeah, yeah. It was yeah, like I said, it was around the time where like that was just becoming popular and those tools were becoming more easily and readily available. And on top of that, my parents have also really always been like speaking of storytelling, always into documentation, like with photography and video cameras, like they always wanted to record things. And so that was like always part of my life.
Do your parents have like a lot of like photo books and I guess like old videos of like you guys when you were little and things like that?
Absolutely. Like if anything, right now we're having conversations about like, okay, logistically, how do we digitize all of this stuff? Because we're so afraid of losing it all, and it's all printed photos and like their little Costco photo center sleeves from like the 90s. So there like there was, there were always cameras around. There was always storytelling happening. My parents were super supportive of like us putting on plays for each other. My parents did their best to create like the perfect little childhood for us. And that like space to create and to explore fed into like my own genuine interest in animation. So yeah, it was stop motion, it was drawing. I recently found a notebook where I was like drawing out my own version of like a movie based on Bionicle. And like in retrospect, I'm like, oh my God, I was drawing a storyboard for the intro to this movie that I was never going to make. So like I think the facets of animation production always fascinated me. And so to fast forward through, I thought I was going to study character animation in college and spent all of high school prepping for that and was rejected from Cal Arts and then got into USC instead for their live action film and TV production program. So I thought that was fate telling me it was time to go in this direction. And then lo and behold, a couple years later, I decided, no, animation's what I want to do. And that's where I find myself today. Yeah. That was a long winded way of answering what got me interested in animation. But I think, yeah, being in an environment of storytelling uh, and very supportive parents who encouraged us to, like, if we drew on the walls, they were like, okay, don't do that, but here's a notebook, draw in the notebook. That all contributed to this fascination with storytelling visually, whether it was comics or drawings or flipbook animation or whatever.
Oh, wow, that's amazing that they were so encouraging of you to kind of keep going in direction and how storytelling in general was kind of ingrained into you essentially for the majority of your life or for your whole life. I think that's amazing. So I know that you said that you thought when you received that rejection letter from CalArts, it was the universe telling you to no, go in this direction instead. So then what told you to go back to animation while you were at USC? Because I know that you worked in live action afterwards too as an editor, right?
That's right, yeah. And I'm so grateful for the training I got at USC because it's one thing to go from like a solo tinkerer, just playing around and coming up with stuff. It's another thing to learn to be on a team and work within the machine of filmmaking. That was super valuable. We had access to really incredible professional grade tools. And, we had professors who had decades of experience working. And I was surprised that what I most got interested in was post production, which technically is the same between animation and live action. But also, it was also really great to learn that, like, I brought a lot of my animation training to my education at USC. Like, I did my best to storyboard everything before I went to shoot, just because I had that habit. I thought it made things easier. And I was even told later on, it feels like you have a very like cartoon sensibility in your shorts, even though they were all live action. I liked doing like trick stuff, like, can you reverse footage to do something funny or interesting? Being very like, cutting on a beat, like there needs to be a reason, like a character needs to be making a choice to motivate cutting to a new angle or something like that. Thinking very like Chuck Jonesy sort of Looney Tunes cartoons, and that's how I thought about live action. And if anything, it took me a while to reconcile that with the very different thing that happens in live action production, where in animation, obviously you do all of your pre-planning going into the day that, an animator actually sits down to animate a single scene. Animation is very asynchronous, and live action production is really dependent on everyone being on the same page at the same moment. Like you assemble everybody for a day of shooting, and there's a lot of spontaneity that can happen. Things will go not according to your plan. You might have planned for the sun to be in a certain place, and then the weather changes quickly. You might have planned for people to be there at a certain time, and someone's running late, or a piece of gear has failed you, and now you have to devote some time to fixing that or working around it. It's a much more spontaneous way of working that took me a while to figure out. I'm not sure I ever fully figured it out. But the beauty of that was learning really quickly to input coming from multiple voices at once. There's everybody on the crew, your actors have their own ideas. It's not you sitting alone tinkering at your computer to come up with something. You're working as part of a team. So that was all super valuable. But leaving school, I was mostly doing work in editing with a bit of filming. I was doing some promo videos for D23, the official Disney fan club, which was great. That was like the best possible first job out of college I could have had. it was super, super fun because, as a legitimate Disney fan, when my boss said, "Oh, we got an interview with Ron and John. Do you mind going to take care of that?" And I was like, "Yes, absolutely. I will happily go speak to Ron and John and ask them a couple of questions about the making of The Little Mermaid or something."
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Exactly that. Yeah, like when they sent me on those interviews, they were like, "Well, Juan's already done the research. Like he knows like specific questions to ask them about." And it was genuinely me being interested. Like I haven't heard. Like, can you talk a little bit about the impact of this facet of the making of Aladdin, or anything that I was genuinely curious about? I could ask. That being said, I was also finding that my impression of career in live action filmmaking tends to be a bit more amorphous than in animation. Animation, obviously, there's a job that you do, there's a hierarchy, there's a ladder toward moving up to supervisor, whatever particular field you are within animation. And live action, it's yeah, there's just a lot more ambiguity. At least that's what I encountered. A lot of ambiguity about what to do next.
What do you mean by ambiguity?
So, for example, I mentioned that job I had out of school. My title was video production intern for Disney Corporate Creative Resources. And so, to my parents, for example, it sounded like this is literally your dream come true. You are shooting video at Disney. This sounds like it is the dream. And I was like, yeah, there's a lot of it that's super satisfying, but my ultimate ambition is to be a writer director. And when you're building experience doing, corporate communications video for a corporate client, that's a different kind of experience that you're having. It's not strictly that. And really, what I was learning was that the world of professional art is different from being an artist of your own accord. You have a client who is paying for the work and you have their interest to answer for. And that is not a bad thing. I know some artists feel a little burnt out when they go into working professionally, like, oh, this isn't everything I wanted it to be. And it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of the deal. My first impression was, oh, this isn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. What I was learning was that it's actually it can be a fun creative challenge to try to answer for your client's needs and to pitch them on how you think you can deliver that, while also being, of course, conscientious of what they really need. But in terms of ambiguity, I was like, I don't see how this leads me to where I want to go. And there were a couple of answers to that. Like there was nothing stopping me from doing like micro budget live action shorts with friends or something. That requires taking some initiative and going out and meeting people who have those skill sets, which is something I could have done. And the solutions I'm seeing, I'm only seeing now in retrospect, because there are fellowships that are focused on helping somebody develop a short or a feature into production, but those really are catered toward people who've done the work before, at least that I've encountered.
Yeah. Who are more seasoned within the field.
And like I said, that's that same shyness about asking for help was still very much in play. So I was move progressing in my career. My next job after that, I was working as an assistant editor, and we were working at a production house, that post production house, that was mostly focused on animated shows. And that was really great because I had that love of animation going into it. So I already knew roughly what the flow was. You spend a lot of time doing the animatic editing, then that goes back to the overseas studio that's actually going to animate the footage. And then I did learn a lot about finishing, which is actually a pretty big step, where they send the footage back, but that by no means are you done. There's so much thought going into what shot leads to what shot leads to what shot, frame count even. But at the end of the day, there's still adjustments you have to make in post once you have all that footage assembled. And that's what I learned a lot about there. And it was there at that job when I was helping to cut animatics and putting in temporary voices and sound effects that I was looking at the work that was coming from the board artists. And I was like, that's the part that's still really appealing to me, is making camera choices and making performance choices, figuring out how a scene is going to play tonally. And I found that, there was that initial ambition to be a writer director. And what I saw from the work of the board artists seemed to be answering to that sort of interest. Obviously, editors are incredibly talented, creative people, and my interest was just elsewhere. And so it was from there that I was like, well, I now have some professional experience. I've worked on a number of animated shows now as an assistant editor, and I have that background in art. It can't take too long to become a board artist myself. I thought maybe I can get that job in a couple of months if I build a little portfolio. And speaking to your point about ambiguity, as I learned more and more, I have a number of friends who are already working in animation. And like I said, I thought I was going to go into that field myself in high school. What I saw was a hierarchy that was a lot easier for me to understand. Going in as a revisionist, working your way up to board artist, and if one is interested in it, working up to director, then supervising director. It seemed like there was a path that was a little bit more straightforward, or at least easier to understand for me. And so I thought, well, okay, then maybe this is the path forward to me. And I thought it would take me a couple of months to land that job. It took me about 4 years, actually. I mark it with the first time I signed up for a class at the Animation Guild in figure drawing, because I was like, oh, this will be a good way to get me started. That was like in 2016, and it wasn't until summer 2020 that I was working as a storyboard revisionist.
Wow, but it sounds like that experience you had with working in editing really did help to apply those skills within your work as a storyboard artist.
The beauty of editing in post production is that it's essentially the same between the two fields, whether you're going into a sound mix and trimming frames here and there to create a feeling. At least on a personal level as an artist, I feel pretty well equipped to at least do a good enough version of a project by myself. I'm a good enough editor that I could edit myself. I'm a decent enough board artist that I could storyboard something myself. I found that having a good editing voice actually helps a lot as a board artist, because it'll be a lot of times I'm in review on an episode and we're rewriting dialogue during animatic review, and we're like, oh, well, that makes this cut feel clunky. And then I'll suggest, well, why not slip that piece of dialogue into this wide shot? So we're not introducing new footage, and everyone's like, oh yeah, that sounds like the idea. Let's do that. It empowers me to not just be like, not strictly someone taking orders as a storyboard revisionist, but helping to offer solutions. And one big way I can be helpful as a storyboard revisionist is to focus all of my attention on this tiny little moment and offer solutions for how we can address that. And a lot of times they're just grateful to get the idea, if the idea is not already coming from them, because obviously they're all super talented filmmakers in their own right.
Yeah, of course. But that's amazing that you were able to bring in those skill sets and, essentially make their lives easier and add more value to the work that you're doing. That's amazing.
Yeah, and especially to that point, the time I spent at USC, extra valuable in that. The movies we studied were all the classics. There wasn't a whole lot of animation that we looked at least not within the context of the film and TV production program. But I think it was super helpful to hold the camera in your hands and to see the difference that a short lens versus a long lens makes on a scene. To see the difference that getting the camera up on sticks like 4 feet off the ground versus right on the ground or even higher, that's a very immediate training. Like, you put the camera in place, you look through the viewfinder, and you're like, oh, so this is what putting the camera at this height with this lens, that's the effect this has on this composition. And to be able to translate that back to a drawing, and to be conscious of, is this a wide lens shot? Do I want there to be like a big disparity in the distance between subjects in the frame? Do I want it to be something that's a little more, do I want a long lens to just get the subjects all maybe a little more claustrophobic in the frame? All that stuff applies to boarding.
Yeah, because you're essentially drawing what you would see in the viewfinder onto paper or on, an animation to the drawing pad that you have, virtually.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, that's insane how all that kind of accumulated to what you're doing now. And then to speak more onto what you're doing now, can you go more in depth to explain to our audience what exactly storyboarding is and what the typical day looks like for you as a storyboard artist or a storyboard revisionist, I should say?
Yeah, absolutely. So storyboarding generally is the process by which the artists on a storyboard team translate. And it depends. There are script-driven shows and there are board-driven shows. So I'll use the example of a script-driven show. That's what I'm working on right now. So screenwriters on another team are putting together the script, the screenplay for the episode at hand. And it is the job of the boarding team to translate that into visuals. So it looks like a comic book version of the entire episode or movie, depending on what you're working in, where camera choices are being laid out for the first time, some performance choices are being made. That later gets turned into an animatic, where that is actually timed out to temporary voices and sound effects to get an idea for what the episode or movie is going to look like as a finished story that you can watch. Storyboards can be really different depending on the intended purpose. So, for example, in television animation, a lot of times the board is being used for a layout. Like, I'm sure we've all seen an example of like the classic SpongeBob cartoons that were being drawn on paper. The board artist was essentially acting as a layout artist. The animators would be tracing on top of what the board artist was providing. By contrast, in feature animation, that tends to be a lot more loose because there is a whole team of layout artists that are doing that work. So the board artist can afford to be a little looser for the sake of drawing more quickly and to iterate more. Just because feature animation, there's a lot more time to explore what the story can be. So one way or another, you're providing rough drawings that suggest what the finished movie or show is going to look like. And as a revisionist on a TV schedule, obviously we're all trying to get episodes done as quickly as possible. So an 11-minute episode on my show will have one board artist working on it for a number of weeks. They'll in the midst of that process, they're being asked to do revisions by the director, supervising director, and showrunner. And at a certain point, they have to leave that board behind and move on to the next episode. And so that's where the revisionist steps in, which is typically a journeyman position up toward board artist, where the board is finished, and then you'll get notes from leadership about what changes need to be made to the board. And it could be for a number of reasons. It could be that there was a line that was a scratch line to begin with, like someone on the crew recorded scratch. And then they finally get production voices from the actual actors, and you realize the performance is actually different. So you have to adjust the drawings to match that performance. Or it'll be network wants to make sure that the characters are all wearing their life jackets when they're near water. So we need to go back and color in those life jackets to be explicitly clear about that. Or sometimes there'll be staging adjustments that need to be made. Like, oh, we're kind of losing this character in this moment. Can we stage the shot from the other side so that we can see them a little more clearly? There's a broad range of things that the revisionists might be doing.
Then with that, how do you think that you're going to adapt what you're doing now and what you're learning now into your career later on, especially within your aspirations as becoming that director and creating your own stories? Because I know you said that you're really passionate about creating these stories about love and friendship and beauty, especially for younger audiences. How do you think you want to translate that for the future?
What I love about being on a crew right now is how much I'm learning from everybody else on the crew. The other board artists, the other revisionists, the directors, the supervising director. These are all people that have their own filmmaking voices. And it's such an incredible thing to have that be the job you go to every day, to be surrounded by other artists and to learn, oh, they typically solve this storytelling problem this way. That's something I can add to my own toolkit. And also getting inspired by the other teams that aren't the board artists. The design team does so much there's so much storytelling that comes out of design. All that to say, everything I'm learning from every other member of the crew beyond just storyboarding as well. And also being part of a regimented program that's meant to get a piece of animation done on a certain amount of time has been really, really helpful for me. And again, it's also expanded my network. Like there are a number of people I work with who I'll probably ask later on as a friend, like, hey, here's this animatic I'm working on. Do you mind giving me some feedback on this?
So yeah, wow, it really shows you how important it is, the collaborative aspect of animation. I think that gives us a sense that it's really not just an individual person that goes, from one person to one person to one person. It really does take the village to bring a project like that to life.
Yeah, absolutely. And leaning in on each other's strengths is such a beautiful thing. Actually, you make me think of something that I've realized for myself in the last week or so. I've become a better writer since I've been working in this job, just because now I feel a little bit more urgency to get writing in front of my peers for their thoughts and feedback and impressions faster, because I can't tell you how many times I've been in a storyboarding review and someone said, oh, this is actually kind of confusing. And the board artist is like, oh, I didn't realize it was confusing. Let's address that. There are just always blind spots that you have. And to share your work with others is a great way to figure those out and use them as opportunities to get the storytelling even stronger.
That's amazing. That really does show how no matter what you're doing in the entertainment field in general, whether it's animation or editing, it's still storytelling and it still helps you to become a better storyteller overall. I think that's incredible. So, what do you think would be one piece of advice you would give to your younger self about pursuing a career like this?
Patience is so key, because whenever you're going out into the world with a goal in mind, there you don't have full control over the whole thing. So much of these goals coming to fruition is dependent on other people. It's dependent on a studio hiring somebody with your taste at the right time. That's something else I've learned. There are really, really great artists out there who maybe they just missed out on an opportunity just because it wasn't the right opportunity for them at the right time. Sometimes, like, if there can be an artist who's an incredible action storyboarder and a crew's like, oh, well, we kind of have our action things covered, but we're looking for someone who's really good at just the quiet drama moments. Or that's not a great example, but I've just learned that sometimes, like, sometimes a show is just hiring at a different time and someone's actually available. And I think this is something I feel compelled to talk about because, we're speaking to hopefully other creators from marginalized communities, but to also be realistic about the opportunities that are easily accessible for us that we might know about versus other populations. Like, why did I get into animation like I did as a kid? I had the luxury of having parents who were incredibly supportive. They didn't know anything about animation and entertainment, but they knew that they saw my passion and they were like, well, give this kid this space to explore this interest. And not everyone's going to get that in their background. And so you might just have a higher hurdle to face if this is your ambition. One thing that served me a lot, because I talk about being a long stretch between deciding I wanted to get into storyboarding and actually working in storyboarding, was to just take inventory of the opportunities I had in front of me or the resources I had in front of me. The examples we see in front of us are always going to be like the big animated movies that have entire render farms devoted to creating gorgeous, gorgeous images. But maybe there's something incredible that you can make with just lines. Maybe there's something really incredible you can make with being mindful of the resources you have available to you. I used to be really into trying to max out the specs on a computer if I ever bought one, because I was like, well, more specs equals more power equals more incredible images I can render. And now I'm like, why not just go for an art direction that's simpler? Do I want to be tethered to a giant machine, or is it possible to create art that's actually not that cumbersome? Because I think at its core, storytelling, gosh, there's so many incredible comic artists on Instagram who are doing stuff with like really simple line sketches. Poorly drawn lines is one of my favorite, and he even uses that in his title, even though his images are obviously coming from a really skilled artist. But it's always super flat staging, super simple character designs, very simple expressions. But the dialogue is so smart and so compelling. Those comics consistently make me laugh out loud. So yeah, I think to anybody who's looking to get into animation, be mindful of the resources you have, but also consider figuring out what do you have that you don't realize you have. Like, one thing I think that I'd encourage young artists to think about now, I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation how VHS cassettes were a thing when I was growing up. And I remember the DVD revolution. That's when they really started packing in, making up documentaries with a movie. And I learned so much from those. The ultimate edition of Terminator 2 was like film school in and of itself. And now, like, all this stuff has been uploaded to YouTube. And there are working artists who run classes where they talk about their own experience. Like, they're working right now and they're creating the learning material at the same time. They're teaching you the skills that artists today are using. There's so many resources like that, so many education resources that are pretty fairly priced. Thinking of Schoolism, which I just resubscribed to. And, these artists who work on these films are all on social media and they post their own work as well. There's a lot out there to learn from. Like, because by contrast, I think I've spoken to people older than me where to get their hands on a script or something, you had to be a student at USC, or you had to have a job as an assistant for a producer who would have these production scripts available. Now, those scripts get published every year around the Academy Awards as PDFs online for free. And you can study like the best screenplays in the industry. You could just read them. You're not putting in any effort to get your hands on it. And it's like, you are reading a script, you're reading a document that convinced the studio to spend $50 million on a movie. That knowledge is so, so easily available.
Even for pilot shows too. I know how many pilots I've found online that could be like, oh my gosh, this was like a 7th season, 10-time Emmy Award winning series. How could you not read it and how could you not learn from it? So I think it really does show how your resources aren't always limited because of, what you do or don't have. You really have to be innovative with it and show that you can really do a lot with a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. The knowledge is there, and then in terms of hardware, like I think I would tell a young person, like, again, take inventory. What do you have? There are some people who are privileged enough to get a nice shiny Cintiq while they're still in high school, and hey, good for them. It's a great tool. There's a reason it's an industry standard tool. But also consider what other options there are. Like there are mono price stylus tablets that are significantly cheaper and so much more accessible. Consider what gear a library might have to offer as a checkout item or other community center like that.
Yeah.
Or consider an illustration style that is not dependent on stylus input, because God knows writing is free. Anybody can do that.
No, I think it really shows how technology has given us the availability to create more easily what we want to do, create our own stories more easily and in our own image. So with that, one of my final questions I really want to ask you on the topic of marginalized communities, what do you think the animation industry can do better to be more inclusive of, Latinx and other marginalized communities and creatives?
It can't happen by accident. It has to be incredibly intentional because the imbalance has been so skewed for so long that to correct it is going to take it's going to take resources, it's going to take money being spent, it's going to take people's job time being devoted to solving that problem. And I know that those I mentioned earlier fellowships and opportunities that are popping up specifically devoted to increasing BIPOC representation within the industry. Whether those are writing fellowships, directing fellowships, that's all great. But I think to me, it's just a start. Those programs need to be sustained. I think that studios need to look for, frankly, easy opportunities to get non-traditional voices in the room. I think it's so impactful for somebody to see someone who looks like they're of a similar background to you doing what it is you want to do, to feel like, okay, there's a role model for me there in one way, shape, or form. I know I would love to see big studios get a little braver about the stories they're putting into production, because I think there's just so much fear about, oh my gosh, how if we make a show about a Mexican family, how is everyone gonna get invested in that? And I'm like, I don't know. I grew up watching sitcoms about white families growing up, and I got into it just fine. Maybe give audiences a little trust, you know? Like, I watched Everybody Loves Raymond. I'm not,
Yeah, and look at a show like Casagrandes now. It's hugely popular on Nickelodeon.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like, I understand the fear that happens when you're at it when I'm putting myself in the head of somebody at a big studio right now. Like, are we gonna spend a lot of money on something that just doesn't look like what other shows and movies look like? But we're also going through a really exciting time right now. For example, what you're doing is a great thing. Like, let's just specify the conversation on Latinx kids who want to be in animation. Focus the conversation on them for a bit and see what kind of stories do they want to tell. What are they not getting in their education? And there are, other big movies and shows that are doing that. So I hope other studios see that and say, we don't have to worry about that other people are alienating an audience by focusing in on a community that's not always seen on the big movie or the big show. And have some faith that audiences will see the universality in the story and hopefully learn. Frankly, I think that it is important to put audiences into positions where they're learning something about the way other people live. I don't know about you, but I feel like I grew up knowing so many conventions of suburban life for white Americans because that's what I was watching.
Oh yeah.
And I think that actually did, help me navigate spaces that didn't look like the one I grew up in. And I hope that we learn more about what our fellow citizens go through every day by focusing on their stories.
Yeah. I think that'll achieve more understanding and more unity amongst us as, people overall when we have that common understanding, that common emotional connection through content that's, diverse and it's universal. I think that's really what all content should be trying to achieve, especially one that's inclusive and one that's showing people of all different backgrounds.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, Juan Luis, where can our listeners follow you at? Where can they connect with you?
Yeah, I am on Twitter and Instagram at Juan Luis Bravo _. You can also find my website at juanluisbravo.com. And I'm regularly on Twitter and Instagram. So if someone wants to say hello or follow their work, I love to connect because, again, I think what you're doing here is great by just highlighting Latinx voices. So hopefully we can find each other and build, again, further community.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Juan Luis, for coming on today. For you folks listening, please follow us at Entertainx Now on Instagram and Twitter. And be sure to tune in next time for another episode of Entertainx. Take care, everyone.